Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the No BS Zone. I'm Bernie Goldberg here with my friend John Daly. How are you, John?
I'm doing all right, Bernie. How about you?
Okay, I think today we'll talk about the murder of Charlie Kirk, various aspects of it. John, the question that has been circulating since his terrible, terrible death is this a turning point? Is this a tragedy that we will recognize and do something about? Will we lower the rhetoric? I have a short answer and I'm going to throw to you. My short answer is no. Nothing is going to change. After those children were killed in Connecticut years ago, nothing changed. After the high school students were killed in Florida, nothing changed. Nothing is going to change at this point. And I don't mean about gun control. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about bringing it down, ratcheting down the nasty, nasty talk. I don't think anything's going to change.
Now, unfortunately, I think you're probably right. In fact, I think it may even get a little bit worse. And part of the reason is that every time there's an act of political violence, the inclination of far too many people, including a lot of politicians and media personalities, is to attribute the violence directly to their political opposition. Sometimes it's the gun control angle, other times it's the rhetoric, but they do this not just in terms of the perpetrator being a right winger or a left winger, and a lot of times they're neither. And when you look at what makes them tick or what made them tick, but also in terms of presenting that person as being representative of the right or the left, or being a product of the right or the left. So you hear phrases like, and we've heard this a lot in recent years, they shot him, or they are coming after us, or they want us to die. When you claim that the other side, the other side, I'll put that in quotes too, um, when you claim that millions of Americans are basically existential threat to people like you, to you and people like you, I think that only further radicalizes people. It puts people on sort of a war footing almost. We've seen that in reaction to Kirk shooting. Jesse Waters is out there saying this is war, we're at war. And so instead of lowering the temperature and compelling people to look at the root or individual causes of political violence, which at times does require some introspection, we just end up fueling more resentment. And I don't think that's good for anybody.
And so the only person responsible is the person who pulled the trigger. Uh,
Right.
but there are contributing factors. We had presidents who were assassinated before the existence of social media. So to blame it on social media is a bridge too far as I'm concerned. But people on social media, there are people who live on social media. They live in the dark corners of social media. They live to celebrate the death of people like Charlie Kirk, to celebrate it. I mean, you collect some of those things. I mean, you read some of those things. I stay clear of it, but I asked you to, if you would gather some examples for me for this piece that I wrote. What kind of people do they have I'm serious about this question. Do they have lives outside of commenting on all sorts of things that rile them up? Do they have lives outside of that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, there's kind of two angles, I think, with the social media. One is the people that do these things. This guy that shot Charlie Kirk, he was online, it looks like all the time, and really soaked into that, soaked into the online atmosphere, which isn't good. But then you're talking about the people's reactions, and to be fair, most people with notoriety on the left offered very thoughtful statements, very decent statements on Kirk's passing. I can think of one or two people who didn't. But the very disturbing stuff, we had the celebrations of Kirk's death, that sort of came from sort of no name left wingers, random people a lot of people, a lot of us don't know. I've also seen, as you described in your piece last week, Bernie, a lot of sort of ordinary people, ordinary lefties, including friends of mine on Facebook, essentially say, yeah, it was bad what happened, but Charlie Kirk said this and that, and he very much contributed to the political anger in this country. So I'm not going to feel too sorry for him. And then I saw that with friends of my own, and then I would see other friends, jump on them for saying that, which would have been fine, except for the fact that those particular friends, I know for a fact, have made light of political violence on their side of the aisle, and and so I think many people, I don't think many people look at themselves as being part of the larger problem, and I'm not sure they ever will. Um, the instinct remains just to blame the other side, and we saw it again. We're seeing it again now.
Along those very lines, John, I had a conversation with a neighbor just hours after Charlie Kirk was killed, and she couldn't wait to take out her phone and read me that quote that's made the rounds. The quote, I don't have it in front of me, but that said, so we may have to accept a death or two every now and then to preserve the Second Amendment. And she had this wry smirk on her face. And I said, can I assume you believe what happened to Charlie Kirk was inexcusable? And she said, yes, yes, it was inexcusable. But she didn't mean it was inexcusable. She meant anybody who would say we have to tolerate a few deaths to preserve the Second Amendment. Well, maybe he had it coming to him. She didn't use those words. I want to be fair. She did not use those words. But like the people you met and were talking to, I think she fit into that category. It's like, no, we don't accept violence like this. No, that's wrong. But he did say certain things that you could understand why he was killed. It's just a horrible thing, a horrible thing.
Yeah, and you described that conversation in your piece for the website. People should definitely check it out. But and what's interesting too, I mean, this is sort of a side note based on what you just said. That particular quote that she read off to you, um, when I first heard it, I thought, oh, that's pretty bad. Then I looked at the full context of it, and Charlie Kirk said a lot of provocative things, a lot of things that in their proper context are really bad. That one was not it's not quite what people portrayed it as. I would definitely recommend people look that up. But he was basically
John, help me out. What is the context of that quote?
yeah, so basically someone was talking to him about the Second Amendment. He was talking about the Second Amendment. And he was sort of trying to make the point that, every year in this country, he starts off by saying that we have, and I'm sure I'm botching the number on this, but let's just say he said, there's 50,000 people die in car accidents. Yet we're not banning cars. We've decided as a society that we're going to accept these 50,000 deaths. These people would otherwise be alive by having cars on the road, out of, just that freedom to do that. He was sort of drawing a parallel between that the same was true that what we've done in the past for guns, basically saying we have these tragedies, but we've as a society accepted this the Second Amendment as this right to have this. So he's saying he was basically endorsing the idea that we accept a certain amount of deaths to have this freedom. And it really, and again, if you don't read it in that context, it's really bad. I think when you actually read the entire interview, and it was a very long portion of this where he was talking, but he was really sort of talking about what we accept as a society to have, even knowing that there is dangers and that it ends up leading to death.
All right. Nonetheless, if you don't like somebody's politics and they say, well, you're going to have to accept a couple of deaths every year to preserve something important like the Second Amendment, they're going to use that against you.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it was, and he even sort of prefaced it that way, saying he knows this will, be a controversial statement. So, I lots of things you could say, point out that Charlie Kirk said that were needlessly angry, needlessly harmful. I think that particular one was deserved a little more context than what it's been receiving online.
All right, let's move on to a related subject, and I want to tiptoe around this. So stay with me. I'm writing a piece about this, which I think will appear next week. You know how comedians, if you tell a certain kind of joke, a historic joke, if you make a joke about Lincoln's assassination, or if you make a joke about the Titanic sinking and all, it was a terrible, terrible thing. And the joke bombs, a professional comedian will wait a beat and then say, too soon? In other words, the joke bombed not because it wasn't funny, but because it's Lincoln's assassination is just too soon to make jokes about. Well, I hope nobody thinks this is too soon because I'm going to raise a couple of questions. Charlie Kirk is getting credit, deservedly so. He's getting credit for going to college campuses and saying, prove me wrong. Go ahead. I mean, I want to hear your side. And this is a question, I'm very serious about this. I think it's important, and John Daly doesn't have any idea of what I'm about to say, so let's see where it goes. I wonder if anybody ever said something to him that shook him from even his most controversial opinions. He said Martin Luther King was an awful person, for instance. He didn't like the talk about the separation of church and state. He had controversial things to say about gays. Did anybody ever say to him on his visits to college campuses, even a thoughtful critic, did Charlie Kirk ever say, that's a good point. I never thought of it that way. I hope it's not too soon to ask a question like that. But with all the praise for him, and like on Fox, it's 24/7. That's all you hear, And I'm not condemning the praise. I want to be very, very clear about that. I am not condemning the praise. I think, and I'm curious to know what you think, John. I think it's a legitimate question to ask. Did anybody ever sway him? Did anybody ever convince him that maybe he was wrong about some of the more controversial things he's ever said? If they have, I haven't heard about it on TV, I haven't read about it in newspapers, and I haven't heard any journalists, any mainstream journalists on TV or in print raise the question that I'm raising now. Again, I hope nobody thinks I'm being disrespectful or that it's too soon to raise the questions that I just raised.
No, and I think it's a good question. I mean, I'm more familiar with Kirk than I think a lot of people were prior to him being assassinated. Most of what I know from him is just what he's put out there, in social media. He's put out there in videos of himself. So I don't know if he was persuaded. I know he changed a lot of positions, like a lot of people did, in the right wing media to accommodate Donald Trump. But that's from a different angle. You're talking
Yeah,
about maybe
exactly.
someone, ideologically. And I don't know that. That's a good question. I have seen it's sort of hard to judge based on the conversations he's had with students on campuses, because he was sort of a master of um, taking, because I'm sure he would get a lot of decent questions. He would also get a lot of uh, you know really vitriolic left wingers who would come up and start yelling at him at his booth, and they would record that as people and put that on Instagram and TikTok and all the other ones, and kind of show, this is what the crazy liberals think, that sort of thing. So I haven't seen a lot of meaningful conversations. I know he did do a sit down interview with Gavin Newsom. I assume there was probably some meaningful dialogue there, but I don't know if
But
Newsom or anybody else ever affected his line of thinking.
it's for me, and maybe I'm out there, playing the deep outfield and don't know what I'm talking about. But for me, it's a legitimate, almost obvious question. If you're praising somebody who had the courage to go to enemy territory, college campuses are notoriously, that's the right word I want to use, notoriously left wing and liberal. Well, if you're praising the person for speaking to people who have different views than yours, and your views aren't always mainstream, Charlie Kirk's views weren't always mainstream. Even conservatives had problems with some of his positions. Don't you think somebody, some thoughtful critic, some intelligent, thoughtful critic might have said something where he said, geez, it's an interesting way to look at it. You know what? I think I was wrong about what I've been saying about that. Anyway, not only have I been able to produce no evidence that he ever said anything like that, I'm equally concerned about journalists who haven't raised the question, but I don't want to dwell on it. You get the last word on that, John.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and it's right now, and again, I don't have a problem with people praising Kirk. There were
No,
things,
and neither do I.
yeah, and I know you don't, I know you don't, yeah, and it's there were things that were definitely admirable about him. Um, you know, you said conservatives, a number of conservatives had a problem with his take at his politics. I was one of them. I was not a fan, of his approach. He did, and this again, I'm saying this with all respect for what happened, but he did spread a lot of reckless conspiracy theories. I think he stoked a lot of anger. I believe for self benefit, like many on the right and many on the left have. Um, and I think it's okay to say that. My thoughts on his politics are really completely irrelevant to what happened to him. I don't have to agree with anything he said. Nothing justifies or rationalizes what happened to him. It's no one should be killed for their words. No one should be murdered. No one should be a victim of political violence here in the United States. So any people that had a problem with what he was saying in life, that really is irrelevant to what ended up happening to him, which was it was an act of terrorism. It was vile, and it should be called out in no uncertain terms from both sides on both sides of the aisle.
All I'm saying before we move on, and I hope I've been clear about this already. If I or any other journalist were interviewing him 2 weeks ago or a year ago, I know I would have said to him, "You're a bright guy. You hold a lot of views that a lot of Americans hold, a lot of conservatives hold, but you hold some pretty controversial views." And I'm wondering if anybody's ever gotten through to you to make you reconsider some of those views. Nobody ever asked him that. Enough. I don't want to go on and on with that. Let me move on to another subject. And it's about ratcheting down the heat and the language, which brings us to our president, Donald J. Trump. The day after Charlie Kirk was killed, Donald Trump went on.
Real quick, Bernie, I think there's something scratching your microphone. Real quick.
I'm sorry. I know what it is.
No problem. No problem.
The day after Charlie Kirk was killed, Donald Trump went on Fox and Friends in the morning. And he was asked a legitimate question by Ainsley Earhardt. How do we fix this? What do we do? And the president, as we all know, is the commander in chief. But he should also be, a great president should also be the uniter in chief. And Donald Trump said, the radical right is radical because they hate crime. And then he launched into who the real villains are. It's the radical left. They want this, they want that, they want the other thing. Maybe he's right in another context about what the radical left wants. They want boys to be allowed to play in girls' sports, things like that. Okay, that's fine, but not for the day after Charlie Kirk was killed. Not for the day after. That's the time, in my view, that a president of the United States should rise above it and at least try, may not be successful, but at least try to bring us together. Somebody close to Donald Trump, somebody who he might listen to, should have gone to him in advance and said, Mr. President, you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity not just to bring people together, but to be looked upon as a great man by trying to bring people together. I don't know if he'd even listen if somebody went to him with advice like that. I'm
Yeah,
not I'm not arguing with the contents of what he said about what people on the hard left want. Again, to use the example, they want biological boys to play in biological girls sport. I'm against that too, but that was the wrong thing to say as far as I'm concerned. Exactly the wrong thing to say on the day after Charlie Kirk was killed. That's the day we needed a president to be a leader, not to be, not to, he had, you know what it comes down to? Somebody has to tell him you're the president of everybody in the United States, everybody, not just your friends in the MAGA base. That's it.
I assume there was probably people in his first term who were telling him that, and at times may have even been able to sort of shift his thinking a bit. I don't think he really has anybody in his current administration telling him that, or maybe he has certain family members who are doing it and he's just not listening. But whenever political tensions are especially high in this country, whether it be a disappointing election result or a terrorist attack somewhere, or in this case, a political firebrand being killed. Unfortunately, you can always count on Donald Trump to sort of throw gasoline on the situation with an attack on his political opponents. People can do, and I know people listening to this now will be doing this, but people can do like a what about Biden or what about Obama? He did they can do that till they're blue in the face. But Donald Trump is our president right now, and ultimately he did again this time do what he usually does, and it's never helpful to the situation, but it is what it is.
Well, how would they feel if Biden did something that they thought was reprehensible, or Barack Obama said something that they thought was reprehensible? They would they would say it's reprehensible.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this is the broader picture before we go. I want to keep this short today. This is the broader picture. If the other guy says something you don't like, it's reprehensible. But when your guy says it, you say, well, the radical left are bad for the country. Those people, they they do say things that don't help the harmony in this country. Yeah, fine. When people start criticizing the other side as well as their side, then I'll pay attention to them. Then I won't consider them hypocritical. Until then, shut up.
Yeah, I think it's true that if you ignore all the bad stuff on your side, it feels like the only side that's doing bad stuff is the other side, and I think that's really how a lot of people approach this. It's just Megan McArdle from the Washington Post. She was talking about a lot of the reaction to this, and I got a quote from her. One thing that's clear from the online debate over whether the left or right is more violent is that many people have an encyclopedic command of the attacks perpetrated by the other side, and they've
Exactly.
memory hold attacks on by their co-ideologists. And that's become sort of this big conversation online and also, on TV. In the wake of this, everybody's now debating, kind of they don't want to look at their own side because they are convinced this is just a problem on the other side. And again, that's easy to do if you ignore, what goes on your side. And I think that's what fuels a lot about this. It's nobody wants to look at themselves, not even themselves, but the people, their co-ideologues, as doing bad things. And so it feels like it's just something you can blame on the other side.
And let me end where we began. Because of what you said, that's precisely why I don't think the answer, why I do think the answer to the question, are we going to change? Will this tragedy be a turning point, if you will? No, I don't. I don't.
Can I add one more thing, Bernie? I wanted to talk about social acceptability of political violence. I read Michael Fanone. Some people know who he was. He was a former DC
Yeah,
police officer.
I read
Um,
that. I read that article. Yeah.
yeah, I thought that was interesting. So people have probably heard Fanone speak out about January 6th, a number of times since it happened. The injuries he received on that day forced him to retire from the police force. So he knows firsthand about political violence. He wrote about Kirk's assassination, and I should mention he 100% condemned what happened, also condemned those who celebrated what happened. He said that those who celebrated are just as bad as the people who cheered for Mike Pence to be lynched on January 6th. But he had sort of a line that I thought was interesting in talking about January 6th. He said, "That day taught me something too many of us are still trying to ignore. Once political violence becomes acceptable, once you decide that your enemy isn't just wrong but expendable, you don't control where it leads." And then he added, democracy doesn't survive in that environment. Free speech doesn't survive. We don't survive. Charlie Kirk's death doesn't make him a martyr. It doesn't redeem his politics, but it does make him another line we've crossed in this country, a line that should never have been crossed in the first place. I'll say it again. Violence is not politics, and if we don't reclaim that principle right now, we're going to lose the very thing that makes this place worth fighting for. I thought that was something people should hear.
Let's give him the last word. Thank you for listening. If you have observations about anything we said, we want to hear from you. And if you think my questions about whether Charlie Kirk was ever moved or changed his views, if you think that was too soon, if you think I was being disrespectful in some way, I wasn't, but if you think I was, let me know. Let John and I know. All right, that's it for this week. We'll see you next time.